Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm managing editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined by senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hello, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, as little as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all of our exclusive religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. Now, for today's show. With the COVID-19 pandemic increasingly in the rearview mirror, worldwide membership for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints topped 17 million by the end of 2022, a 1.17% increase from the previous year. But that growth was hardly wall-to-wall. Some places grew much faster, some much slower, and some saw their rolls shrink. There were encouraging signs. Africa, for instance, led the way again, boasting 8 of the 10 nations with the fastest rates of membership growth. There were troubling stats, too. Ukraine, not surprisingly given the war there, saw its Latter-day Saint totals fall, and Russia's ranks reported for the first time in 5 years cratered, plunging by nearly 80% since 2017. In the United States, southern states enjoyed the quickest gains, while the Northwest numbers continued to slide. And Utah, home to the faith's headquarters, experienced stunningly anemic growth. Joining us today via Zoom to dig into these figures is a leading expert on the topic, Matt Martnick, an independent researcher who tracks church movements for the websites Cumorah.com and LDSchurchgrowth.blogspot.com. Matt, welcome.
Thanks for having me, David.
Yeah. Oh, so Matt, give us a general overall, how does the church growth look emerging from the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. So the numbers have recovered mostly from what we saw prior to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of annual membership growth rates for the church as a whole. It's still, again, pretty low compared to what we've seen in previous decades, where we're seeing annual membership growth rates for the worldwide church just being a little over 1%. That used to be much higher, usually about 2 to 3%, for example, 20, 30 years ago. So that number still remains much lower than we saw historically, but it is higher than we saw during the COVID pandemic, though. So overall, again, those numbers are going back to what we would expect to see from prior to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of membership growth rates.
Okay, so what's the best barometer for church growth? Is it these raw membership numbers that where the church reports, or is it new stakes that created those regional congregations, regional clusters of congregations, or is it new congregations like wards or branches? What's the best one to really show how the church is growing?
Well, there really isn't a best one. They all provide different facets of growth. And also they can all be, to a certain extent, I don't want to say manipulated, but they can be measuring maybe what you think they're measuring. So, for example, with membership growth, that's an important statistic to track because it shows how many people are being added to the records, or if people are being removed. We can get some inferences from that with how those rates change over time. But at the same time, we don't have any really, those numbers really provide no helpful information in terms of active membership. That's just who's on the records, whether sometimes these people even realize it or not, if they're baptized as a youth, and sometimes I've even totally forgotten about it. So it really doesn't provide a good measurement of activity, but it does give an indication of how the membership is changing. Or if it's stagnant or growing or declining or whatever. Now, with congregations, that oftentimes can be a useful barometer for active membership growth, just because usually we need to have so many active members to create new congregations. However, that number can be inflated if we have, let's say, a country where we have a lot of new branches being created in previously unreached cities. Those branches will have very few members on the records because they're brand new. And so that membership growth might not look that impressive compared to the congregational growth for those countries. And then it can make it misleading where it looks like the membership is, increasing at a much more rapid rate than it actually is. And the reason why is because the number of active members per congregation is declining because we're getting more congregations being created, but these are new congregations with few members. However, that does tend to be a pretty good number over time. Sometimes in terms of how mission presidents, area presidencies, stake presidents, how they might change how they really what their goals are with the growth of a church in an area, those numbers can be changed, where maybe there's an emphasis on creating larger congregations with more active members, maybe creating smaller ones to try to spur more involvement from the membership. So again, they can be useful, but they do have their limitations. And with state creations, the same type of thing can be seen too. But again, usually that is a good indication of membership growth. That's active membership growth, because otherwise you can't sufficiently staff stakes with not enough active members. And over time, we will see stakes consolidate in areas where active membership is declining because there's just not the resources to support the previous infrastructure that was put in place.
So Matt, everyone wants to know how many active members there are. How do you guys determine that? And what's it based? What is the basis of it?
Yeah, that's a hard thing to do, because it isn't a black and white thing if you're active or not. You can have people that go to church that, hey, I just go because my spouse goes and I don't believe any of this stuff. So you can have, that side of the spectrum where someone comes to church every week. And sometimes even you have people that it's a couple where you have a spouse that belongs to another faith, but they come with their spouse for church. And so they'd be counted for attendance, but they're not even a member. So, it gets complicated with that, Peggy, but what I would say to answer
in general, just make a broad statement.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So I think really the best way to track that is collecting data from members and return missionaries and church leaders in terms of how many people will come to church on average, and then looking at that average and comparing it to the number of members in that country. And so we can extrapolate from that data a rough estimate of member activity rates. And so that's, again, typically done on a congregation by congregation level, which can be very painstaking for countries with a lot of members. But if we have a sample size of 200 or 300 congregations, then we can really probably make some good estimates what things look like. So most of my data I have is from before the COVID-19 pandemic. And at the time, worldwide membership, probably about 30% were active, which translates to about 5 or 6 million members. But again, there's a lot of gradations there where you have, like, if you just look at that attendance number, you're going to miss people that are sick, they're out of town. And so typically that attendance number might be a little lower than the actual number of true active members. But then, of course, you have to adjust for some of those other situations I mentioned previously. So, but anyway, in terms of how things have been affected by COVID, it's really hard to say. There's a lot of variability with the reports I've gotten from different areas of the world, with some places reporting an increase in member activity, and other places reporting a decrease, and others reporting no change. And so I think really the best way to tell how COVID's affected activity rates is really to see how those trends pan out over the next couple of years and see what things look like with those some of those indicators that are published by the church that the public has access to.
So where is the church growing the fastest?
Well, in general, Africa stands at the top of the list, which has been a recurrent trend for decades. And that's in terms of annual membership growth rates. And so this last year, Burundi membership increased by approximately 50%. Rwanda increased by approximately 37%. Tanzania, Mozambique. So one of the things that's interesting with this last year is that we saw a big increase in membership growth rates in East Africa, which has been an area in the worldwide church that's been one of the more neglected ones that has a lot of potential for growth. And with the church creating its Africa Central area just in the last couple of years, I imagine that these growth rates are being reflected by an increase in resources allocated to that region of the world. But if you were to compare the number of Latter-day Saints in Tanzania, for example, which is approximately 3,000 now, to the number of Jehovah's Witnesses or Seventh-day Adventists, it's just a drop in the bucket. Latter-day Saints are an extremely small minority in these nations, but it has been a growing one. And in these countries, another interesting development has been an emphasis on using the local languages there and not using English as the lingua franca for church meetings. And so we see that with Swahili and Tanzania, for example, and Kenya-Rwanda and Rwanda as well. And so that also, I think, has explained some of the the increase in growth in some of those countries. Democratic Republic of the Congo has been one of the fastest growing countries for a number of years. And the thing that's so fascinating with that country is it's a country that has been entirely self-sufficient with its missionary force for decades and achieves very high rates of member activity and convert retention. I mean, it's quite common in the DR Congo for congregations to have as many people in attendance as they have on church records, which doesn't really happen anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And if it does, it's usually in the very early stages of the church in a country. So again, really quite the anomaly and really becoming a significant powerhouse for the church in so many areas in Africa right now.
Hey, can I just ask a quick follow-up? I know back 10 years ago or so, there were some congregations starting in Sudan, but they're not missionaries there, right?
Yeah, there's never been proselyting missionaries assigned to South Sudan. There has been mission president visits there, and that resulted in a lot of people being taught very briefly. There was a branch that operated in Juba for just a few years, but there's no official church presence in the country anymore. And I believe that's really related to the significant safety concerns there. And there's just, unfortunately, like with the DR Congo, you have this base of native members that has the leadership and everything there to make the church run without outside support. Whereas in South Sudan, they just don't have that, unfortunately. Although we have seen success with Sudanese joining the church in other countries, there's just fairly recently, about a year or so ago, if I am remembering correctly, they had a Nur Dinka branch created in Salt Lake City. For Sudanese that have joined the church there. And there used to be one in Omaha, Nebraska for a few years, about 15 years ago.
Before we leave Africa, Matt, let me ask you about like the DR Congo and the bigger ones where the church is at six figures. They're in the six figure, like Ghana, Ethiopia. When the church gets an input, which is still minuscule as to the overall population, of course, when it gets that big of an input, does the growth tend to accelerate or slow? I mean, I know the rate might be affected, but does that actually help the church grow more when it gets to that point?
That's a fascinating question, David. And typically what we see, just in broadly speaking, with church growth by country in the world, is that it's really hard to achieve that level of growth once you get to six figures like that. It's quite unusual. I mean, the last time we saw a country with that was over six figures with over 15% membership growth rate. And that's what Democratic Republic of the Congo was last year, was 15% annual membership growth rate. The last time we saw that was over 30 years ago. And that was like in Ecuador and the Philippines. We did have 1 year where Nigeria, where the church grew by just barely 10%, but it would only happen for 1 year. And then it went down to below that. So that is quite an anomaly, and it's very interesting and encouraging, especially because with those other countries I mentioned, they did not have the member activity rate that the DR Congo has, and that was done with so many foreign missionaries doing the baptizing, and so there is a lot of differences between the two. So it is really pretty unprecedented, just given the scope of things. So. Yeah.
So, well, let's talk about the flip side now. Where is the church growing the slowest or declining, and why might they be?
Yeah. So if you look through the list, if you were to go through, okay, how much did the church grow or decline in a given year? In the last few years, there's a group of countries where they will vacillate from being, growing a fair amount and not growing at all. A lot of those are countries with very few members, less than 1,000 members, and they're very sensitive to just small changes like that. So I'm not going to address those countries usually because they're just not really providing much accurate information. But in terms of larger countries that experienced, the most rapid decline, Ukraine was at the top of the list for membership growth decline in 2022 was 7.8%. And I believe that is primarily driven by many Ukrainian families who have left the country. And so I've had contacts in different countries in Eastern Europe who have talked about how they're hosting a number of Ukrainian families, especially in the Baltic states. And so that's where those members have more than likely gone in that time. And if you notice, there is a little bit of an increase from what we've typically seen with membership growth rates in some of those countries, which would explain that's where they went. So I think that explains a lot of it, as well as potentially, I'm not sure if there's been many casualties deaths with Latter-day Saints in Ukraine, but there was a branch, like, for example, in Mariupol, and my understanding is the whole branch pretty much left, is my understanding. But there has not been much information I've been able to get, unfortunately, with what things look like in Ukraine in terms of membership movement. And one interesting thing was that the church's second stake in Ukraine was created just before the war started, and in Kharkiv. And so I'm not sure how that's affected, how those stakes are functioning now. But when we have a war like this, it's usually pretty catastrophic for disrupting membership and leadership, and things really tend to start to fall apart quite a bit, unfortunately.
Where else outside of Ukraine, where we can kind of see the reasons why that membership number is different?
Yeah. So another trend we're seeing is that in Micronesia, we have like Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia. Those were in a top 10 list of countries that had the most rapid decline. I mean, it's only 2%. So it's a small decline. That seems to be driven by members of the church in those countries moving to the continental United States. And we've seen a commensurate increase in congregations, particularly for Marshallese. There's a number of Marshallese wards and branches now in the United States. So I think that is really best explained by that. And in terms of the Europe numbers, I mean, really, that's just been stagnant for the most part. I mean, during the 2-year period during COVID, we did see a decline in membership in like Germany and France. This last year, we didn't see that. We saw an increase in membership. And then we have some countries like Slovakia and Slovenia and places like that where it's just super flat growth or doesn't grow at all. And that's just been the case for many years now. Now in Asia, the only country that's on that top 10 list that was in that, where the church is growing most slowly or it's declining is in Singapore. And that's also been a trend for several years now where we've seen a consistent decline in membership in Singapore.
Okay, I'm going to jump really close to home here for us. You called in a blog about when the state-by-state numbers in the U.S. were released. You called the latest numbers from Utah the biggest unexpected development in the church's numbers. What did those numbers show, and why was that unexpected?
Yeah, great question. So membership growth in Utah is usually about 1% to 2% a year. And last year, it was just 0.56%, which is much lower than we typically see. I mean, to being half the rate or even a quarter of the rate of what we usually see. So that's very unusual. The church in Utah has grown very consistently in terms of membership growth. And my hypothesis on why that happened is that it seems to be likely affected by Latter-day Saints in Utah moving to other states. And the reason why is because we had a pretty big increase in membership growth rates in a lot of states during 2022, that some of which really surprised me, like New York. I mean, New York was on that list, grew by 2.4%, which is a pretty big increase for New York. Typically, that's a state where church grows very, very slowly, or it's just, stagnant. So, that's my thought, is that in terms of that's why we've seen that anomaly. It could be to other factors as well. I mean, Utah has a pretty strong counterculture to the church, so that might reflect more resignations perhaps, or, just catching up over time with unbaptized children of record being removed. It could be perhaps different causes like that. But that's what I found most surprising, just because it deviated so much from what we typically see for the church in Utah.
Yeah, especially since Utah is was the fastest growing state, for the last decade. And so there's been a lot of people. Now, that's outside of what their church affiliation is. But so much movement here of other, newcomers to the state. So you would think it would be Latter-day Saints moving here, possibly because they could now work remotely and still work in Silicon Valley or whatever. It just seems counterintuitive a little bit.
Yeah, and that's what the trend we saw really like during COVID. I mean, most of the membership growth we had was just in a couple states, and one of them was Utah.
Yes.
So I wonder if it might have to do with property values being more expensive. I know that's been oftentimes a big draw for members of the church to move to the motherland, is they can get some cheaper real estate. They can sell their house in California and take the equity and get something really nice in Utah. Of
course, now housing prices are soaring in Utah too. So yeah.
Could it have anything to do with what President Oak said the other night, which is Latter-day Saints having fewer children?
That doesn't help, that's for sure. I mean, that's been a long-term issue, though, but we're not going to have all of a sudden in 2022, all these Latter-day Saints decide to stop having kids in 1 year. It doesn't make sense to me. So I that's been a long-term trend, and I think that's really the primary contributor to why membership growth rates in the United States have fallen so precipitously during the last couple of decades, is because they're just having fewer and fewer kids. It's much rarer now to see families that have more than 3 kids. It's not that common anymore with millennial age group, especially.
So California and its neighbors in Oregon and Washington continue to see membership declines. What do the numbers show, and what do you think is happening there?
Yeah, Washington's interesting because the church in Washington has generally experienced regular positive growth for decades, and really where the congregations are being closed or membership is moving away or perhaps going inactive is in the Seattle area, especially. It's been very hard hit. But we have growth in other areas like Spokane. We have growth there. In the Columbia River Valley, that area tends to continue to grow. So I think it might be more of an issue of members moving around. A lot of times in the United States, especially membership growth and congregational growth, it's more a matter of where people are moving as opposed to people joining the church or leaving the church or having kids or passing away or whatever. A lot of it's more driven by that. I mean, just as an anecdotal example, I was in a ward previously here in Colorado Springs that was a very strong ward, 175 people come to church a week, and within 2 years it was discontinued. And it was because most of the members moved away within about 18 months. So a lot of times in the United States, we can see some pretty rapid changes. And a lot of times that's usually more on a more local level where they're going from one area of the city to another. And you see it a lot in Salt Lake, where you have people going from the older areas like Cottonwood areas, Butler, South Salt Lake, and they're moving to like Harriman, or they're moving to upper part or the north part of Utah County or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's been a trend we've seen for decades. That's been going on.
So Matt, the numbers are relatively small compared to out west, but in the South, the church is growing. I mean, its numbers are. Is the church really gaining strength there? Does that reflected in congregational growth too, and creation of new congregations and such?
Yes. Yeah, it certainly is. Like in Arkansas, we regularly have, most of that growth is in the northwest quadrant of the state around Rogers. So we've seen some really quite impressive stake and congregational growth there. We have a couple stakes there that'll probably divide any day because they're both pretty large congregations. And even in neighboring Oklahoma, we had 2 new stakes that were just created in the Tulsa area. And we have also had stakes recently created in southwestern Missouri. So that is a very popular area where we're seeing a lot of members of the church moving there. I don't think much of that growth is driven by converts, though. Areas of the South where we tend to have more converts join the church would be like Florida and Tennessee. Those tend to be states where we have more converts join the church based on the reports that I've gotten.
So we alluded to this already, but how does membership factor into temple building? Is there some kind of correlation? Do you have to have a certain number of members to get a temple, or is it more?
Yeah, I think in the last 5 years, all of the previous trends have been kind of thrown out with that, Peggy, in terms of how we see where temples are being announced, because a lot of times before there were certain factors that pretty closely correlated to new temple announcements, like increase in number of stakes, also distance to the nearest temple, how busy the nearest temple is. Another factor that's been one for a long time is how old the oldest stake is in an area. So those are all factors that can be predictive of where a temple is announced. Whereas more recently, it seems like the goal now is for temples to be within less than an hour's drive of where most members live. And that's why we get temples like Yorba Linda, California, for example, or Winchester, Virginia, both of which weren't even on my radar at all when they were announced. I was really, really surprised with both of them for different reasons. So I think that in terms of temple construction, you do need to have a certain minimum number of members. A temple that is located in the place that has the fewest number of members would be in the United Arab Emirates, but they don't have the temple built there, but that's less than 2,000 for that country. And then operating temple would be Guam, I believe. Guam has about 3,000 members, if I remember correctly. So that's not very many, and that's a very small temple that really is just there to provide the bare minimum for what is needed for it to be a temple. So, but it's a long answer to your question, Peggy, and my answer to that is that, well, it kind of depends, but I think there's other factors that are more at play in terms of number of members for when temples are announced.
Do you think it's partly a public, I don't want to say public relations, like that's not a real thing, but to say, look, we Latter-day Saints, we're here, we're building a temple, even though we don't have a lot of members, a kind of a visual plant the flag kind of thing?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that if that was the case, that would have been done a lot longer ago, if that was the case. I mean, typically what I've seen and read about when temples are announced, it usually results in fairly positive relationships being developed with the communities that they're in. Although at first there's a lot of times a lot of opposition. I think it's really more of a move to make temples more accessible, and as in doing so, hoping to improve member activity rates over time. I think that's a much more logical explanation than to just announce temples to make it look good on the surface, because that doesn't make much sense.
Tell me how many members in Rome in Italy?
In Italy? I think there's about probably 25,000, something like that.
Active members?
No, total members.
Okay.
In Italy? Was that your question, Peggy?
Yeah. Rome seemed like a symbolic presence.
Oh, actually, sorry, it's 28,000. So it's 27,993. So yeah, I think with the Rome one, I mean, that one definitely has a lot of bells and whistles on it. So I mean, it is a very beautiful temple that's very big for a pretty small membership, especially considering most of the active membership don't live nearby. They live in northern Italy. So I do think there's some cases like that, but you don't see very many of those. I can't think of many others that fit that mold. Most of the temples that are being announced now fit more of the mold that we saw with President Hinckley announcing all those temples 20, 25 years ago, where it's really more on function and accessibility as opposed to it being like a Utah temple that has endowment sessions scheduled every 30 minutes or every hour. I mean, a lot of these temples aren't even open every day of the week. They just have maybe one or two endowment sessions. But that way people can go to the temple regularly in some of these more remote areas. So
this accessibility does seem to be, I mean, they've stated this over the pulpit. That's one of their their goals. And it might explain why some temples are showing up in, say, places in Europe where there's been virtually no growth. Growth has nothing to do with it, in a sense. It's just going back and saying, well, they're still too far away from a temple. We've got this base that's been there for a long time.
Yeah. And I can relate with that. I mean, as I've taught on your program before, I live in Colorado Springs, and if traffic and weather are good, it takes an hour to get to the temple in Denver. If it's not, then it can be like a 2-hour trip, and it really takes the fun out of the experience. And it makes it hard, especially if you're have a young family and you want to go to the temple regularly. It's just not feasible if it's that far away. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think especially a lot of the emphasis on youth being involved with temple attendance, I think that's been another big reason why we've seen a big increase in temple announcements, is really to try to get the youth and recent converts involved in temple work earlier, and that can help them stay active for the long term.
Okay, we talked about Ukraine. Let's talk about the other adversary in that unfortunate war. Let's talk about Russia. In 2017, the church reported there are more than 23,000 members. And Russell Nelson announced plans to build a temple there in a major city in 2018. But fast forward now to today, and missionary work is virtually outlawed. There's been no public progress on a temple, and the church is now reporting for the first time, fewer than 5,000 members. Like I say, they haven't posted those numbers, and you've noted this in your blog for a number of years. What do you think is at play there, Matt?
Well, I think what those numbers represent, because that's a pretty major decrease in just 4 years. So that clearly can't be because they all died or they requested their membership records to be removed. That is just not a realistic explanation. I think the most plausible explanations are that we had a lot of active members that have left the country, due to the war, and as well as other conditions there. And I think another plausible explanation is that, and this is probably the most likely one, is that the church is only reporting those members that self-identify as a member of the church. And that way, they're just reporting that figure, which makes a lot more sense. And that'd be much closer to the number of active members in Russia anyway. So I think that's probably the best explanation.
So last question, how could the church more effectively and lastingly grow its membership? What's your view about that? What should it be doing?
Well, that'd take a long time for me to answer that question, I think, Peggy. One thing I want to mention too, David, just on your comment about the Russian numbers not being reported and being reported this last year, there's dozens of countries and territories that don't have membership numbers that are reported, even though there's not a sensitive presence there. And I've tried repeatedly to contact the newsroom media staff there to let them know. And we still don't have those numbers. So that'd be great to have numbers for Senegal, Gabon, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, Vietnam. But unfortunately, my request, I guess, fall on deaf ears or something.
This is the church's newsroom you're referring to there. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I've asked for years. All these numbers were previously reported in the Almanac series that was discontinued about 10 years ago. But anyway, so I just wanted to add that tidbit in there, is that, there's a lot of countries that aren't a part of the analysis. Some of them are sensitive countries where I understand why the church wouldn't publish membership data for those. And there's plenty that aren't, and they're just off the list. And a lot of them are countries that have a more recent church presence, like I mentioned, Senegal, but Guinea, the Gambia, Gabon, and so forth. But going back to your question, Peggy, so I think a lot of it has to do with resource allocation. Interesting thing in the church is that the church has a lot of resources in terms of money, and also a lot of resources in terms of people that can serve missions. The church puts its missionary forces around the world, not based on where people are necessarily most receptive to learning about the church, but more based on opportunity for everyone to hear about the gospel is really kind of my understanding of that. And that's why we have missions like Norway has its own mission, and Denmark has its own mission, and Sweden has its own mission, and Finland has its own mission. Now, with a lot of other proselytizing focused Christians, I don't think they put that many resources into an area of the world that isn't that productive in terms of people that are wanting to meet with missionaries and so forth. Also in the church, a lot of resources are allocated based on membership distribution, not based on opportunities to reach populations. And so that's why we have so many missions in the United States, which is an area of the world that could probably very effectively meet its missionary needs just with the local members doing that missionary work. But then we don't have, we just got a mission in Rwanda that covers also Burundi and part of the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. That mission was organized last year. And but there's been religious freedom in that country and in that area of the world for, decades, where the church could have had a presence established. So, so that's one of the reasons why the church doesn't grow as much, is based on how the resources are allocated. And of course, there's a lot of other factors that go into that too, Peggy, in terms of like United States growth rates, but a lot of it has to do with natural increase in the church and birth rates continuing to decline in the church, fewer people marrying in the church. Those are all, really big challenges for achieving growth that continues in the United States in particular.
Matt Martinick, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks for your diligent research. We count on that. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Unfortunately, I haven't had as much time to dedicate to this in recent years as I used to. But that's just what happens with life sometimes. But I still make my effort to make sure I'm in the loop on things as much as I can.
Yeah, well, be well, okay? And thanks to Peggy Fletcher-Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Winfield. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.